Okay, so whichever essay question you're going to answer, you're probably going to want to imbue it with your interpretation of Hamlet and his problems. This lecture is probably most relevant to those looking at the flawed nature of the characters and how that engages audiences through time with Hamlet, because what I'm going to look at is what my interpretation of the cause of Hamlet's conflict and inability to act is. So that's what I'll be looking at. This is not the only possible reading of Hamlet, his character, and his problems. This is a very specific reading that I've done by framing my analysis with a very specific concept. So I'm about to talk at you for a fairly long time, but I'm not sorry. This is important teacher talk. This is teacher talk that shows you the way that you can frame analysis of a character through a particular kind of theory or concept, and it's teacher talk that I hope you'll find valuable. I'm going to do almost a political reading of Hamlet through the lens of looking at him as a Renaissance man. So the Renaissance man refers to the Renaissance, which people describe as happening between the 14th and 17th century. It has to do with renewed interest in classical figures and life. I think actually my next slide shows you some of the core elements of the Renaissance, but it has to do with men who have a range of talents and ability and knowledge. So the Renaissance, the word Renaissance comes from the idea of rebirth from French. It's a period in history in Europe following the Middle Ages, which was considered to be a time of not very much prosperity, where life starts to get better and people have a renewed interest, a surge of renewed interest in classical values. The Renaissance saw the discovery and exploration of new continents. It saw changes in how we understood the universe and the stars in the sky through astronomy. It saw the downfall of feudal systems and an increase in commerce and economic growth. Innovations such as paper, printing presses, compasses, and gunpowder. So technology starts to develop again as well. And for the scholars and the thinkers of that day, however, it was really a time that was about reviving classical learning and wisdom after what was seen as a long period of standstill or stagnation in development. So reflecting back on what people thought were good intellectual values and ideas to follow and hold. So a tension emerges between these new Renaissance values and Christianity. The Renaissance was not an abandonment of Christian beliefs and values and return to antiquity. It was a revival or renewal of interest in antiquity that is occurring within an established system of Christianity. So it doesn't totally uproot Christianity in any way at all. People try and sort of reconcile the two and make them work together. In 1543, so 50 years pre-Shakespeare doing most of his stuff, we have the collapse of Constantinople leading to a whole bunch of classical scholars moving into Greece and Italy, and they bring with them Greek literature, i.e. stuff by Homer. This exposes the West to Greek texts that they'd heard about but they'd not been able to read because they hadn't been translated into Latin. And suddenly art begins to mix Christian and classical images and ideals, and we have iconography of the two start to appear within the same texts. That's how we know that they are merging. We have Christian iconography or symbols, we have classical images and iconography and symbols mixing and appearing in the same texts. Hegel, who's a philosopher, gives us a definition of tragedy that isn't about right or wrong. He says, in this little nice pretty quote from Instagram for you, that genuine tragedies in the world aren't conflicts between right and wrong, they are conflicts between two rights. So according to Hegel, A tragedy happens not when a hero picks wrong over right. A tragedy really happens when a hero asserts a just position, like a real, genuine, substantially, kind of morally, intellectually correct position, but in asserting that position, simultaneously violates an equally just position on the alternate side. And so by violating that other position, falls prey to this one-sidedness that is defined at the same time by greatness and guilt. That they know that what they are fighting for is great, but they have guilt in that what they are violating is also just and true. So they're at once being moral and immoral, if you like. This is a different understanding of tragedy. So the conflicting values that arise are occurring between these classical virtues that come from things like Plato's Republic, virtues to do with fortitude, courage, prudence, and temperance, and Christian values that are more to do with belief, faith, hope, charity, things like that. As such, a classical hero, a hero of antiquity, is someone who is concerned with their present moment actions. The present life, the one they are living right now, is the life in which they are able to achieve glory through battle, through fighting for a cause, whatever it is. And revenge often features as a motivation of that epic heroic narrative, as a reason that they have to go out and act heroically. They aren't worried about afterlives. It is this life in which they have to prove themselves, and if they are worthy and successful in doing that, they will be remembered and revered after their death. Christianity, however, seems to forbid vengeance. It values kindness and caring for others, it forbids killing, and it places that value on the afterlife as opposed to this life. So the classical world is the idealized world that is symbolized by Hamlet Senior. And we have this: that he might not beteem the winds of heaven, visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth, must I remember? Why, she would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on, and yet, within a month, let me not think on it. Frailty, thy name is woman. A little month or ere those shoes were old with which she followed my poor father's body, like Niobe, all tears, when she, even she, oh God, a beast that wants of discourse of reason would have mourned longer, married with my uncle, my father's brother, but no more like my father than I to Hercules. So we have this speech which gives us a whole bunch of imagery early in the play to immediately associate Hamlet Senior with those classical heroes, with Hercules, with the heavens, with that classical sense of strength and heroism. We also have this: see what a grace was seated on his brow, Hyperion's curls, the front of Jove himself, an eye like Mars to threaten and command, a station like the herald Mercury, new lighted on a heaven-kissing hill, a combination of form indeed, where every god did seem to set his seal to give the world assurance of a man. This was your husband. And this is Hamlet describing his dad to his mother as though maybe she's forgotten how excellent a man he was. And he describes him using all of these references to Mercury and Mars and heaven and to gods who have made a man so much in their likeness that he is there to reassure humanity of goodness in the world. So Hamlet reveres the classical world. He looks up to his dad, he associates his dad with this classical world. He is complex and he's often accused of thinking too much. He appreciates the intellectual aspects of life. He tells us when he agrees to do the ghost's bidding that he's going to remove all of the learning from the book that is his brain, and when he refers to his brain as a book, we understand that learning is important to him. So we have Hamlet the intellectual. However, he has been asked by this ghost to do a terrible deed for good or just reason, revenge. His love for his father makes him want to see this revenge through, but he's troubled by an inability to do so, to see this act out. The tragedy of Hamlet may well be that he is a Renaissance man. He's complex, he's intellectual, he's brave, and he's in a world that demands a traditional classical hero. As an audience, we get given two characters that act as foils almost to Hamlet, and what they do is they represent the different features of Hamlet that coexist within him. So we have Horatio, who is very loyal, he has good judgment, people trust him, he's intellectual, he's thoughtful, he's hesitant around superstition, he wants evidence for things, he's very logical. And we also have Laertes, who is brave, he is strong, he is unafraid, he is a man of action. And both of these characters represent parts of Hamlet that Hamlet could draw on in order to achieve his goal. Evidence for Laertes being this strong go-getter kind of figure he says, "How came he dead? I'll not be juggled with. To hell allegiance, vows to the blackest devil, conscience and grace to the profoundest pit. I dare damnation. To this point I stand, that both the worlds I give to negligence. Let come what comes, only I'll be revenged most thoroughly for my father." So we have Laertes give a speech in which he says he's willing to risk both this life and the next in order to enact his revenge. That he doesn't care. He dares damnation to come for him. He is not afraid of rules that suggest you should not kill or you should not act in vengeance. They don't bother him. He is our classical hero. Claudius gives a speech back to Laertes, and Claudius says, "Not that I think you did not love your father, but that I know love is begun by time, and that I see, in passages of proof, time qualifies the spark and fire of it. There lives within the very flame of love a kind of wick or snuff that will abate it. And nothing is it like goodness still, for goodness, growing to a pleurisy, dies in his own too much. That we would do. We should do when we would, for this wood changes and hath abatements and delays as many as there are tongues, are hands, are accidents. And then this should is like a spendthrift sigh that hurts by easing. But to the quick of the ulcer Hamlet comes back. What would you undertake to show yourself indeed your father's son more than in words?" And Laertes, to this challenge from Claudius, who says, "It's easy to say you love someone, but prove it. How far would you go to prove it?" Laertes says, "I would cut his throat in a church." And that is highly symbolic of Laertes' disregard for the kind of Christian values, that is really sacrilegious to kill in a church that forbids killing. He's willing to do that for his father. Then we have evidence that Horatio is our classical Stoic. Stoicism comes from an ancient Greek school of philosophy, and the school taught that virtue, the highest good, is based on knowledge, that to be the best person you can be, you must have as much wisdom and knowledge as you can about things. The wise live in harmony with divine reason, also identified with sort of fate, that governs nature. The wiser you are, the closer you are to understanding how the world works and how fate and things like that come about. And you're indifferent to the vicissitudes, of fortune. You're indifferent to pleasure and pain. So the more you logically understand the world around you, the less you will struggle with things that you don't understand, like pleasure and pain. If you can understand them, they won't bother you. Hamlet describes Horatio. He says, "Horatio, thou art even as just a man as ever my conscience coped withal." He says, "You are so just. You are the most just person I know." And Hamlet says, "Nay, do not think I flatter. I'm not flattering you. For what advancement may I hope from thee that no revenue hast but thy good spirits to feed and clothe thee? Why should the poor be flattered? No, let the candied tongue lick absurd pomp, and crook the pregnant hinges of the knee where thrift may follow fawning. Dost thou hear? Since my dear soul was mistress of her choice, and could of men distinguish, her election hath sealed thee for herself. For thou hast been, as one in suffering all that suffers nothing, a man that fortune's buffets and rewards hast taken with equal thanks. And blessed are those whose blood and judgment are so well commingled, that they are not a pipe for fortune's finger to sound what stop she please. Give me that man that is not passion's slave, and I will wear him in my heart's core, I in my heart of heart, as I do thee. Something too much of this. So Hamlet makes a speech where he promises Horatio that he's not just flattering him because he's his friend, that his judgment of people is really, really good, and he has known for a long time that Horatio is good and he is wise, and that Horatio is so logical and wise that Fortune, who gets personified in this speech, she isn't able to toy with Horatio. Horatio can't be manipulated by others because of his good judgment. His judgment is part of him and his blood and his character. And Hamlet admires that because he can't quite be that person, because Hamlet is also in some ways passion's slave and driven by this sense of revenge. Horatio says that he will not follow superstitions, that he wants evidence for things, and Hamlet says to him, there are more things dreamt of in heaven and earth, Horatio, than in your philosophy. And Hamlet points out that maybe there are things that we can't understand, that Horatio is ignorant to and unable to access because of his really logical disposition. He says, I am no more an antique Roman. He says, I am more an antique Roman than a Dane, to characterize himself as being someone who doesn't follow the same beliefs that everyone else in Denmark does, that he subscribes to a much more classical understanding of the world. So these two supporting characters serve as examples of the conflicting forces within Hamlet's complex characterization. It is really complex and it is really layered, which is why there are lots of different ways that you can read it. But I think this conflict is Hamlet's flaw, that he can't decide which kind of hero to be. If Hamlet were to act purely as the sort of active, pride, courage-driven Laertes, he would kill Claudius immediately. However, if Hamlet were to be the classic intellectual that's embodied by Horatio, he actually wouldn't be bothered by the ghost's demand for revenge at all, and he would feel no guilt about deciding not to act and follow the ghost's requirements. So the thoughtful intellectual Hamlet is often the version picked up on in romantic productions. There's lots of evidence for the classical thoughtful side of Hamlet in the text. In the graveyard scene, Hamlet says, let me see, and takes the skull. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fantasy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now, how abhorred in my imagination it is, my gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning, quite chapfallen. Now get you to my lady's chamber and tell her, let her paint an inch thick, to this favour she must come, make her laugh at that. Prithee, Horatio, tell me one thing. So Hamlet takes this skull of someone that he knew, and he says, well, you're not laughing now. And he starts to wonder about mortality and about death and about all of these social structures that hem him and everybody else in and require things of him and dictate his fate. And so he says, no, faith, not a jot, but to follow him thither with modesty enough and likelihood to lead it as thus. Alexander died. Alexander was buried. Alexander returneth to dust. The dust is earth. Of earth we make loam, and why of that loam whereto he was converted, might they not stop a beer barrel? Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Oh, that earth which kept the world in awe should patch a wall to expel the winter's flaw, but soft a while. So he starts thinking about really important people like Caesar, and thinking about Alexander the Great and how they get turned back into these natural elements that get used for really everyday mundane things like beer for a poor man to drink, or plugging of a hole to keep wind out of someone's house. Really mundane things. They get reduced to this. That is all they become. So Hamlet's thoughtfulness and interest in classics should make him not afraid of revenge, but make him able to fight for right without this fear of consequences. Classic heroes had strength, and they overcame problems with great feats of strength, of intellect and power, and they did so without regard for what would happen to them afterward. So yes, Hamlet is a thoughtful prince, but he's not driven like a classical hero by his intellect entirely. And he's definitely not a precious flower like many people make him out to be. He is like the Elizabethan snowflake, according to some critics. And we know he's not a precious flower. He's not weak. He kills Polonius. He sends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to their deaths without remorse and without even giving them their right of last confession. Hamlet says, "Why, man, they did make love to this employment. They are not near my conscience. Their defeat does by their own insinuation grow. 'Tis dangerous when the baser nature comes between the pass and fell incensed points of mighty opposites." People are like, do you feel bad about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? And Hamlet says, no, I'm not even thinking about them. No, that was their own doing, you know. Why should I feel any guilt about that? So we know he is, in some ways, very tough. But while he might be tough and he might be intelligent, the Christian part of Hamlet's character complicates the situation he's in. He makes continual reference to the incest between his mother and his uncle, and how their marriage and intimacy offends his Christian values and offends God. But he cannot take absolute revenge. He needs to know some way of taking this revenge that won't compromise his own soul, because he believes in heaven and hell and he worries about these consequences. His Christian beliefs drive him to act because he's been offended by the marriage, but he can't reconcile the violence needed to re-establish the proper order within the rules of Christianity that praise kindness. We know he's worried about these Christian elements because there's evidence for it in the text. He references Cain's jawbone that did the first murder, and he doesn't want to become like Cain. He worries for his soul, and for my soul, what can it do to that, being a thing immortal as itself? It waves me forth again, I'll follow it. And so he worries about his soul even in the beginning when the ghost asks him to come with him. He goes only knowing that his soul can't be harmed by this ghost. And then in Act 3, Scene 3, he gets the opportunity to kill his uncle, but he chooses not to. And he explains his choice in this speech. Now might I do it. Now he is a-praying, and now I'll do it. And so he goes to heaven, and so am I revenged? That would be scanned. A villain kills my father, and for that I, his sole son, do this same villain send to heaven? Ah, this is hire and salary, not revenge. He took my father grossly, full of bread, with all his crimes broad blown, as flush as May. And how this audit stands, who knows, save heaven? But in our circumstance and course of thought, 'tis heavy with him. And am I then revenged to take him in the purging of his soul when he is fit and seasoned for his passage? No. Up, sword, and know thou a more horrid hint. When he is drunk asleep, or in his rage, or in the incestuous pleasure of his bed, at game a-swearing, or about some act that has no relish of salvation in it, then trip him. that his heels may kick at heaven, and his soul may be damned and black as hell whereto it goes. My mother stays the physic, but prolongs my sickly days. So in this speech, Hamlet worries that he's found Claudius alone, praying and repenting almost for his actions, and he worries that if he kills him now, he kills him in a state of repentance, he will go straight to heaven, and that's not truly revenge. He wants Claudius to go to hell. So he delays acting and killing Claudius and reconciles this by saying that he needs to catch him doing something bad so that he goes to hell and not to heaven. So if Hamlet were only a classical hero, he wouldn't be concerned about the state of his victim's soul. This must come from his sort of Christian understanding of the world. The task asked of Hamlet is one that requires a classic hero's ease of action. However, the society and situation in which the task has been requested is much more complex than classical time. In order to exact the complete revenge, Hamlet needs Claudius to go to hell, and to do this, Hamlet must be able to see into people's souls and know when Claudius's soul is compromised enough to go down and not up to heaven. And souls then become really problematic for Hamlet. And we have this speech that we've talked about this speech already, and that he worries about the consequence on his soul were he to do the wrong thing and just give up. And then we have this speech where he toys again with the idea of non-existence, to be or not to be. And this is the pagan sort of classical option. If death were just an end and there was no sort of Christian consequences, then to die would be really easy and maybe possibly attractive and nice. And he says, for who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of deprised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin, with a sort of little knife. Why would anyone put up with this if they could just easily end it? And he asks that question, and it's a classic Roman attitude to problems. If things go wrong, if you're captured, instead of lose your honor, you can just kill yourself. But Christianity distorts Hamlet's ability to act as those heroes would in the classical sense. And Christianity makes cowards of us all with this threat of afterlife and of souls. He says, who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under weary life, but that the dread of something after death, right? Consequences, heaven, hell, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will. His ability to act according to his own will is confused by the threats for what will happen afterwards. And no one's been able to come back and tell us about that time, so we don't really know what happens. Thus, conscience does make cowards of everyone. They worry about that, and so that influences how they act. And they lose their inability to act. They lose the name of action. So Hamlet is this figure who is torn between classical and Christian values and heroism. He is a sort of Renaissance man in a situation that requires a traditional bloodthirsty hero. The tragedy of Hamlet is the tragedy of the facets of his character that make him a man of interest, intelligence, and complexity, are the same facets that will cause his downfall. They are both his strength and his flaws at once. Hamlet's inability to decide what to do leaves him only able to really react to everything else around him. He can respond to the action of others, but he can't decide how to be an active member of his own fate or destiny or will. In Act 5, he comes to this recognition that he can be a passive actor in a situation and just kind of leave things to God's plan. And there seems to be some reconciliation for him here between his two sides, but the reconciliation comes at the cost of his life. It's fatal, not just for Hamlet, but for others. And he says, not a whit. We defy augury. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man of aught he leaves knows, what is it to leave betimes? Let be. And you can hear the reconciliation, the understanding that kind of what will be, and that in being passive, he can find out what God's plan is. And some people call this a cop-out, but I guess that's essentially Hamlet's flaw, his inability to act. What is interesting is the origin of that flaw. Is it that he is a kind of guy who doesn't fit in the situation that he's been put in the castle, the social structure that he's in? Is it cowardice from his Christian side? Is it overthinking things from his intellectual side? Is it the conflict of the two trying to coexist and his inability to decide between them? That is his actual flaw that leads to his demise. And they're all really interesting questions. And I think for me, it really is that conflict. It's the coexistence of these different requirements on him and his character and his inability to adhere to one side of them, and in doing so transgress the other, that makes him unable to act and makes him almost give in at the end and makes this a true tragedy.